the mountainside like a shroud, weaving between the ancient pines that had stood sentinel over the valley for centuries. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen pressed his eye to the scope of his Barrett M82, the cold metal kiss of the rifle stock familiar against his cheek. 3 clicks to the left, 2 up. He'd made these calculations 1,000 times before, but never under circumstances quite like these. The distance marker on his scope read 2,847 meters, nearly 3 kilometers of thin mountain air, shifting, winds, and the kind of shot that existed more in legend than reality. "Impossible," muttered Corporal Davies from his position 15 meters to Chen's right. His own rifle, a customized Remington 700, was trained on the same distant target. A2, red balloon tethered to a pole on the opposite ridge. The balloon danced in the morning breeze like a crimson ghost, mocking their efforts. Even Macmillan couldn't make that shot in these conditions. Chen knew Davies was referring to Craig Harrison's record-breaking 2.475-meter kill in Afghanistan, a shot that had redefined what the world thought possible with a rifle. But this was different. This was 372 meters beyond that legendary distance, with crosswinds that shifted every few seconds and atmospheric pressure that made their ballistic computers practically useless. The radio crackled to life, carrying the gravelly voice of Major Richardson from the observation post below. "Gentlemen, you have 30 minutes to demonstrate the viability of long-range precision fire at these distances. The brass needs to know if we're wasting our time and taxpayer money on this new equipment." The new equipment in question was a prototype rifle system that had cost the military more than most people made in a lifetime. Experimental ammunition, advanced ballistic computers, and a rifle that looked like something from a science fiction movie. It sat on the table behind them, untouched and gleaming in the morning light, while Chen and Davies worked with their familiar, battle-tested weapons. Chen adjusted his position slightly, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulder from years of carrying heavy equipment across hostile terrain. At 34, he was considered old for a sniper, but his record spoke for itself. 127 confirmed kills across 3 deployments, including shots that had saved countless American lives. The young Marines called him Ghost because of his ability to appear and disappear without a trace, but Chen preferred to think of himself as simply a craftsman who happened to work at extreme distances. "Winds shifting again," Davies observed, studying the mirage patterns through his scope. The corporal was 26, eager, and possessed of natural talent that reminded Chen of himself at that age. Davies had been selected for this experimental program based on his performance in Quantico, where he'd consistently outshot instructors with decades more experience. The balloon continued its erratic dance, and Chen found himself calculating, not just the ballistics, but the psychology of the shot. Every sniper knew that the longest shots weren't just about mathematics and physics, they were about patience, breathing, and that moment of perfect stillness when the universe seemed to hold its breath. He'd felt it before, that strange sensation where time seemed to slow and the target appeared to grow larger in his scope, as if the very act of perfect focus could bend reality. A movement caught his peripheral vision. Someone was walking along the ridgeline to their left, about 800 meters away. Chen lifted his eye from his scope and squinted into the distance. The figure was slight, moving with an easy confidence across terrain that would challenge experienced hikers. As the person drew closer, Chen could make out long dark hair and the distinctive silhouette of someone carrying a rifle case. "Who the hell is that?" Davies asked, following Chen's gaze. Before Chen could respond, the figure raised a hand in greeting and began making their way down the slope toward their position. The approach took nearly 10 minutes, during which both snipers watched with growing curiosity and concern. When the newcomer finally reached their concealed position, Chen found himself looking at a woman who appeared to be in her early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes and calloused hands that spoke of serious trigger time. "Gentlemen," she said, setting down her rifle case with practiced care, "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez. I've been assigned to observe your trials today." Her accent carried hints of her Latina heritage, but her English was precise and unaccented. She wore civilian hiking clothes, but something in her bearing suggested military training. Chen and Davies exchanged glances. No one had mentioned an observer, certainly not a civilian. "Ma'am, with respect, this is a closed military exercise," Chen said carefully. Dr. Vasquez smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Chen's instincts prick up. "I have clearance from Colonel Morrison himself. I'm here to evaluate the psychological aspects of extreme long-range shooting. Understanding the mental state required for shots at these distances is crucial for training future snipers." She opened her case, revealing a rifle that Chen didn't immediately recognize. It was sleek, almost organic in its design, with what appeared to be carbon fiber construction and optics that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. "I was hoping you might allow me to attempt the shot as well. For comparative data, you understand?" Davies laughed, but not unkindly. "Ma'am, no disrespect, but this shot is at the very edge of what's humanly possible. We've been preparing for weeks, and we're not even sure we can make it." Dr. Vasquez began assembling her rifle with movements so smooth and practiced they seemed choreographed. "I understand your skepticism, Corporal, but sometimes fresh eyes can see possibilities that experience might overlook." As she worked, Chen found himself studying her technique. Everything about her movements suggested someone with serious training, but there was something else. A quality of focus that reminded him of the meditation practices he'd learned from a Buddhist monk during his deployment in Afghanistan. The monk had taught him that perfect shots came not from trying harder, but from trying less, from becoming so still that the rifle became an extension of his will. "The wind patterns here are fascinating," Dr. Vasquez continued, not looking up from her rifle. "They create a kind of spiral effect around the mountain peaks. Most people would see that as an obstacle, but spirals have their own rhythm. If you can find that rhythm—" She trailed off, having finished assembling her weapon. The rifle was unlike anything Chen had ever seen. The scope seemed to be made of some kind of crystalline material that caught and reflected light in unusual ways, and the barrel had an almost liquid appearance as if it had been grown rather than manufactured. "That's quite a weapon," Chen observed. "It's experimental," she replied, then looked directly at him with those intelligent dark eyes. "Much like the techniques I use," Major Richardson's voice crackled over the radio again. "Snipers, you have 20 minutes remaining. I need to see some shots downrange." Chen returned to his position but found himself distracted by Dr. Vasquez as she settled into her own shooting stance. There was something hypnotic about the way she moved, a fluid grace that seemed to extend to every gesture. She didn't use the standard shooting techniques he'd been taught in sniper school. Instead, she seemed to meld with her rifle, becoming part of a single system. Davies took his shot first, the crack of his rifle echoing across the valley. Through his scope, Chen watched the bullet's vapor trail streak toward the target, only to see it pass several feet to the right of the balloon. The corporal cursed softly and began making adjustments. Chen lined up his own shot, controlling his breathing and waiting for that perfect moment between heartbeats. The balloon seemed to pause in its dance for just an instant, and he squeezed the trigger with the smooth pressure he'd perfected over years of practice. The recoil was sharp against his shoulder, and he watched through his scope as his bullet cut through the air. For a moment it looked like it might actually connect. The trajectory seemed perfect, the calculations correct. But at the last second, a gust of wind caught the bullet and pushed it just wide of the mark. Another miss. "Damn," Chen muttered, already calculating corrections for his next attempt. It was then that he noticed Dr. Vasquez had been watching their shots, but she hadn't taken aim herself. She sat beside her rifle in what looked almost like a meditative pose, her eyes closed and her breathing so slow and controlled it was barely perceptible. "Ma'am?" Chen asked. "Are you going to take your shot?" She opened her eyes and smiled again. that same enigmatic expression that suggested she knew something they didn't. "In a moment. I'm just listening to the mountain." Davies rolled his eyes and muttered something about civilians and their mystical nonsense, but Chen found himself intrigued despite his skepticism. He'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know that experienced hunters and shooters sometimes developed an almost supernatural ability to read environmental conditions. Maybe there was something to her unusual approach. Dr. Vasquez finally moved to her rifle, but instead of immediately taking aim, she spent several minutes adjusting what appeared to be a series of small crystals mounted along the barrel. Chen had never seen anything like them. They seemed to pulse with their own internal light, and the patterns of their pulsing appeared to correspond to some rhythm he couldn't quite identify. "Interesting equipment," he commented. "Harmonic resonance compensation," she replied, as if that explained anything. "Every environment has its own frequency signature. If you can match that frequency, you can work with the environment instead of fighting against it." Chen wasn't sure what to make of that explanation, but he had to admit the woman's confidence was impressive. She moved with the kind of certainty that came only from extensive experience, and despite her unconventional methods, there was something undeniably professional about her approach. When she finally took her shooting position, the transformation was remarkable. All the fluid grace he'd observed earlier seemed to coalesce into perfect stillness. She didn't appear to be aiming so much as becoming one with her rifle, her breathing so controlled it was nearly imperceptible, her trigger finger resting with the lightest possible contact on the trigger. And then something extraordinary happened. Without any visible movement, without any apparent squeeze of the trigger, her rifle fired. The sound was different from the sharp crack of Chen and Davies' weapons. It was deeper, more resonant, almost musical in its tone. The bullet's vapor trail was visible for only an instant before it seemed to bend and weave through the air, following a path that defied every principle of ballistics Chen had ever learned. All three of them watched in stunned silence as the bullet curved around what should have been deflecting air currents, compensated for wind shear that should have thrown it wildly off course, and struck the balloon dead center. The red target exploded in a shower of latex fragments that drifted slowly to the ground like confetti. The silence that followed stretched for long seconds before Davies finally found his voice. "What the hell just happened?" Chen was staring at Dr. Vasquez, whose rifle now lay across her lap as if she'd never fired it at all. Her breathing was still controlled, her expression serene, and most disturbing of all, Chen was absolutely certain he'd never seen her pull the trigger. "How?" was all he managed to say. Dr. Vasquez smiled and began disassembling her rifle with the same fluid efficiency she'd shown in putting it together. "The shot was always possible, Sergeant Chen. You just have to know how to ask the mountain for permission." The debriefing room at Forward Operating Base Echo felt smaller than it actually was, its concrete walls seeming to press inward as Major Richardson paced behind his metal desk. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, emphasizing the deep lines that 15 years of military service had carved around his eyes. Chen sat rigidly in his chair, still processing what he'd witnessed on the mountain, while Davies fidgeted beside him, occasionally glancing at the door as if expecting Dr. Vasquez to materialize through solid steel. "Let me get this straight," Major Richardson said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled tension that preceded either commendations or court-martials. "A civilian contractor, supposedly here to observe psychological factors in long-range shooting, made a shot that both of you missed, at a distance that exceeds current military records, using equipment that neither of you can adequately describe." He paused in his pacing, fixing Chen with a stare that had intimidated junior officers for over a decade. "And you're telling me that you never actually saw her pull the trigger?" Chen shifted uncomfortably. In all his years of service, he'd prided himself on being observational, analytical, precise in his reporting. But what he'd witnessed defied every framework he'd developed for understanding the world. "Sir, I watched her the entire time. Her finger was on the trigger. Her position was perfect, but there was no visible trigger pull. The rifle just fired. "Rifles don't just fire, Sergeant," Richardson snapped. "They fire when someone pulls the trigger. What you're describing is either a mechanical malfunction or some kind of remote firing system, both of which would be highly irregular for a civilian contractor to possess." Davies cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, if I may, there was something else. The sound of her rifle was different, deeper, almost like music. And the bullet trajectory. I've never seen anything curve through the air like that. It was like it was following a programmed path." Richardson's expression darkened. "Corporal, are you suggesting this woman has access to some kind of guided ammunition? Because that would be a serious breach of operational security, not to mention a violation of several international treaties regarding autonomous weapon systems." Before either sniper could respond, the door opened and Colonel Morrison entered, followed by Dr. Vasquez herself. The woman looked exactly as she had on the mountain, calm, composed, with that same enigmatic smile playing at the corners of her mouth. But now, in the harsh light of the debriefing room, Chen noticed details he'd missed before. Her hiking clothes were expensive, probably custom-made, and beneath her casual demeanor was a bearing that spoke of command authority. This wasn't just any civilian contractor. "Gentlemen," Colonel Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of gravity that made everyone in the room straighten instinctively. Morrison was old-school military, a man who'd earned his rank in some of the Army's most classified operations. "I believe some explanations are in order." Dr. Vasquez moved to the front of the room with that same fluid grace Chen had observed on the mountain. She carried a briefcase that seemed to be made of the same strange material as her rifle components. "Sergeant Chen, Corporal Davies, what you witnessed today was a demonstration of Project Harmonic, a joint venture between the Department of Defense and several private research organizations." She opened the briefcase, revealing what appeared to be a three-dimensional holographic display. Images flickered to life above the case, showing complex mathematical equations, wave patterns, and what looked like topographical maps overlaid, with mysterious energy signatures. "For the past 5 years," Dr. Vasquez continued, "we've been researching the intersection between quantum mechanics and ballistics. The traditional approach to long-range shooting treats each variable, wind, humidity, temperature, atmospheric pressure, as separate factors to be calculated and compensated for. But what if these aren't separate variables at all? What if they're all part of a single interconnected system that can be harmonized rather than overcome?" Chen stared at the holographic display, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The equations were beyond his understanding, but the topographical maps looked familiar. "Ma'am, those are the mountains where we were training today." "Exactly. Every geographical location has what we call a resonance signature, a unique combination of electromagnetic, gravitational, and atmospheric factors that create a kind of environmental fingerprint. My rifle doesn't fight against these forces, it harmonizes with them." Davies leaned forward, his skepticism evident. "You're talking about some kind of, supernatural shooting? That's not possible." Dr. Vasquez's smile widened. 5 years ago, I would have agreed with you. I was a traditional ballistics engineer, focused on improving muzzle velocity and reducing bullet drop. But during a research project in the Himalayas, I encountered something that changed my entire perspective. The holographic display shifted, showing what appeared to be satellite imagery of a remote mountain range. Chen recognized it as somewhere in the Hindu Kush, terrain he'd operated in during his second deployment. We were testing prototype ammunition at extreme altitudes when our equipment started behaving strangely. Bullets were traveling farther than physics said they should. Trajectories were curving in impossible ways. At first, we thought it was equipment malfunction, but then we realized we were witnessing something unprecedented. Colonel Morrison stepped forward, his expression serious. "Dr. Vasquez, perhaps you should explain about the monastery." Chen felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard stories during his deployment, whispers among the local guides about places in the mountains where the laws of physics seemed negotiable, where certain individuals could accomplish impossible feats through meditation and spiritual practice. He'd always dismissed them as superstition. "There's a Buddhist monastery," Dr. Vasquez continued, "hidden deep in the mountains where the monks have been practicing what they call unified field meditation for over 1,000 years. They believe that consciousness itself is a force that can influence physical reality at the quantum level. Most Western scientists would dismiss this as mysticism, but quantum physics suggests that consciousness and reality are more interconnected than we previously understood." The holographic display now showed what appeared to be brain scan imagery, with complex patterns of neural activity highlighted in different colors. "I spent 2 years living at that monastery, learning their techniques while simultaneously conducting scientific research. What I discovered was that human consciousness, when properly trained and focused, can influence quantum fields at a microscopic level. This influence propagates outward, affecting everything from air density to electromagnetic fluctuations." Davies was shaking his head. "You're saying you learned to shoot bullets with your mind?" "Not exactly. I learned to create harmony between my consciousness, my equipment, and the environment. The rifle still fires conventionally, but the bullet travels through a medium that has been optimized for its passage." Chen found his voice. "The crystals on your rifle, what are they?" "Quantum resonance amplifiers. They're grown, not manufactured, using a process that combines traditional crystal cultivation with quantum field manipulation. Each crystal is attuned to specific environmental frequencies." She gestured to the holographic display, which now showed the distinctive crystalline structures he'd seen on her rifle. When properly synchronized with the shooter's consciousness and the environmental resonance signature, they create a kind of pathway through which the bullet travels. Major Richardson had been silent throughout this explanation, but now he stepped forward, his expression a mixture of fascination and concern. "Dr. Vasquez, are you telling us that you've weaponized meditation?" "I've learned to work with natural forces rather than against them. The monks taught me that separation between self and environment, between intention and action, is an illusion. When you truly understand this, extraordinary things become possible." Chen remembered something from his time in Afghanistan. Conversations with local elders who spoke of warriors who could shoot arrows around corners, soldiers who seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they happened. He'd always attributed these stories to exaggeration and legend, but now he wondered if there might have been more truth to them than he'd realized. "The trigger," he said suddenly. "I never saw you pull the trigger." Dr. Vasquez nodded approvingly. "Very observant, Sergeant. In the traditional approach, there's a distinct moment when the shooter makes the decision to fire and then executes that decision by pulling the trigger. But what if the decision and the execution could be unified? What if intention itself could become action?" She moved to the center of the room, and Chen noticed that her presence seemed to change the very atmosphere around her. The harsh fluorescent lighting seemed softer, the cramped space somehow more expansive. The monks have a concept called effortless action, Wu Wei in Chinese philosophy. It's the idea that the most effective action is that which feels like no action at all. When I fire my rifle, I don't pull the trigger in the conventional sense. I simply allow the shot to happen. My intention becomes reality through the harmony I've created between myself and the environment. Davies was staring at her with a mixture of awe and unease. This changes everything. If this technology exists, if these techniques can be taught. Colonel Morrison's expression had grown increasingly grave during the discussion. That, Corporal, is exactly why this briefing is classified at the highest levels. Project Harmonic represents a fundamental shift in how we understand the nature of warfare itself. The holographic display shifted again, now showing what appeared to be training scenarios. Chen could see figures moving through obstacle courses, but their movements were unlike anything he'd seen in conventional military training. They moved, with the same fluid grace he'd observed in Dr. Vasquez, and their shooting positions looked more like dance or martial arts than traditional marksmanship. "We've been developing training protocols," Dr. Vasquez explained, "but the process is challenging. Not everyone has the capacity to develop these abilities, and even those who do require extensive psychological and spiritual preparation. The techniques can't be separated from a fundamental shift in how one perceives reality." Chen felt a growing sense of unease. "Ma'am, what happened to the other test subjects? The ones who couldn't adapt to the training?" Dr. Vasquez's expression grew somber for the first time since he'd met her. "That, Sergeant, is a more complicated question than you might realize. The boundary between consciousness and reality is not as stable as most people believe. When you begin to influence quantum fields with focused intention, there can be consequences." The room fell silent, and Chen found himself thinking about the Buddhist monk he'd met in Afghanistan, the one who'd taught him about stillness and focus. The monk had warned him about the dangers of seeking power over the natural world, saying that true mastery came not from controlling external forces but from understanding one's place within them. "The shot you witnessed today," Dr. Vasquez continued, "was just the beginning. The implications of this technology extend far beyond military applications. We're talking about a fundamental redefinition of human potential." Colonel Morrison stepped forward again, his voice carrying a weight of authority that commanded immediate attention. "Which brings us to why you're both here. The Army is forming a new unit, one that will integrate these techniques with conventional special operations capabilities. We need soldiers who can adapt to entirely new paradigms of warfare." Chen felt the room spinning slightly, as if the revelations of the past hour had shifted his entire understanding of reality. "Sir, you're asking us to abandon everything we've learned about marksmanship, about physics, about how the world works." "No, Sergeant," Dr. Vasquez said softly, and there was something almost compassionate in her voice. "We're asking you to expand it. Everything you know is still true, it's just not complete. The question is whether you're willing to learn what else is possible." As she spoke, Chen noticed something that made his blood run cold. Dr. Vasquez's rifle case, which had been sitting closed beside her briefcase, was now open, and the rifle inside was assembled, loaded, and pointing directly at the wall behind Major Richardson's desk. But no one had touched it. The silence in the debriefing room stretched like a taut wire until Davies finally found his voice. "The rifle, it's—" He couldn't finish the sentence, his training warring with what his eyes were telling him. Dr. Vasquez followed their gaze to her weapon, and for the first time since Chen had met her, genuine surprise flickered across her features. She moved toward the rifle case with measured steps, her fluid grace now carrying an undercurrent of wariness. "That's unexpected," she murmured, reaching for the weapon. The moment her fingers touched the stock, the rifle began to emit a low, thrumming sound, the same musical tone Chen had heard when she'd fired on the mountain, but deeper, more resonant. The crystalline components along the barrel pulsed with increasing intensity, casting prismatic light across the concrete walls of the debriefing room. "Dr. Vasquez," Colonel Morrison's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I think you'd better explain what we're dealing with here." She lifted the rifle carefully, and Chen noticed her hands were trembling slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. "The quantum resonance amplifiers are responding to something I don't understand. They're designed to harmonize with environmental frequencies, but this—" She gestured to the pulsing crystals. "This is beyond anything I've encountered before." "Major." Richardson had backed against the far wall, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. "Are we in danger?" Before Dr. Vasquez could answer, the lights in the room began to flicker. Not the random strobing of electrical malfunction, but a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to match the frequency of the rifle's crystalline components. Chen felt a strange sensation building in his chest, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through his bones and into his very consciousness. "Something's wrong," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice tight with concern. "The harmonics are cascading beyond the weapon's parameters. It's like—" She paused, studying the readouts on a small device she'd pulled from her pocket. "It's like the rifle is responding to something that isn't here." Davies, who had been staring at the weapon with fascination despite his obvious fear, suddenly looked up sharply. "What do you mean, isn't here?" Dr. Vasquez was now actively working to disassemble the rifle, her movements quick and precise despite the tremor in her hands. The monks at the monastery spoke of something they called the echo, a phenomenon where consciousness-based interactions could create imprints in the quantum field. These imprints could persist across time and space, potentially influencing events far from their origin. Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "You're saying there's some kind of ghost in your rifle?" "Not a ghost," she replied, finally managing to separate the barrel from the stock. The moment the components separated, the thrumming sound ceased and the lights returned to normal. "But possibly an echo of consciousness from someone who worked with similar technology." Colonel Morrison stepped forward, his expression grim. "Dr. Vasquez, I need you to be completely honest with me. What aren't you telling us about Project Harmonic?" She set the rifle components down carefully, then turned to face the group. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of sorrow that transformed her entirely from the confident scientist they'd been listening to. 3 years ago, we had another test subject, Dr. James Kowalski, a former Marine sniper who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He was brilliant, better than me, at understanding the theoretical framework, faster at developing the consciousness-based techniques. He could make shots that defied belief, hit targets at distances that shouldn't have been possible even with our technology. The holographic display flickered back to life, showing what appeared to be training footage. Chen watched a tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair moving through shooting exercises with an almost supernatural precision. Every shot was perfect, every movement economical and deadly. But James became obsessed with pushing the boundaries further. He wanted to explore what he called temporal harmonics, the possibility that consciousness could influence events not just across space, but across time. The monks had warned us about this, told us there were aspects of their training that were forbidden, too dangerous to explore. Davies leaned forward. What happened to him? Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, staring at the frozen image of Dr. Kowalski on the holographic display. He disappeared during a training exercise at a facility in Nevada. One moment he was there, making impossible shots, talking about breakthrough discoveries. The next moment, he was gone. Not just missing, gone, as if he'd never existed. The only trace left behind was his rifle, still warm from firing, and a series of quantum resonance readings that our equipment couldn't interpret. Chen felt pieces clicking into place in his mind. The rifle responding to something that isn't here. James's consciousness may have become entangled with the quantum field in ways we don't understand. If consciousness can influence reality, and if that influence can persist as echoes across time and space, then it's possible that part of him is still connected to technology similar to what he was using. Major Richardson had been listening with growing alarm. "You're telling us that this Dr. Kowalski might still be out there, in some form, and that he's somehow affecting your equipment?" "It's more complicated than that. According to the monks, consciousness that becomes too deeply entangled with quantum fields can lose coherence, become distributed across multiple probability states. James might exist in several different realities simultaneously, or he might exist in none of them. But his influence, his intentions, his trained responses, those could persist as patterns in the quantum field. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. Chen found himself thinking about the stories his grandfather had told him about the Vietnam War, tales of soldiers who'd seemed to develop supernatural abilities after extended combat, exposure, only to disappear mysteriously or suffer psychological breakdowns that defied conventional understanding. Colonel Morrison's voice was carefully controlled when he spoke. "Dr. Vasquez, are you suggesting that consciousness itself can become a weapon?" "I'm suggesting that consciousness has always been a weapon. We just haven't understood how to use it effectively. Every great sniper knows that the physical act of shooting is only part of the equation. The real skill lies in the mental preparation, the ability to become completely present in the moment, to unite intention with action so perfectly that the outcome becomes inevitable." She gestured to the rifle components. "Our technology simply amplifies abilities that already exist within human consciousness. But amplification can be dangerous if you don't understand the full scope of what you're amplifying." Davies had been examining the crystalline components with obvious fascination. "These crystals, where do they come from?" "They're grown in the monastery using techniques that combine traditional crystal cultivation with meditation practices. Each crystal is attuned to specific consciousness frequencies through a process that takes months of focused intention and spiritual discipline. The monks consider them sacred objects, not mere tools." Chen suddenly understood why Dr. Vasquez had seemed so different on the mountain, why her presence had felt almost otherworldly. "You're not just a scientist, are you? You're one of them. One of the monks." She smiled sadly. "I was initiated into their order, yes. It was the only way to truly understand the techniques we were trying to adapt for military use. But the initiation process changes you in ways that can't be reversed. Once you've learned to perceive reality at the quantum level, once you've experienced the interconnectedness of all consciousness, you can never go back to seeing the world as separate, solid objects interacting through purely physical forces." The holographic display shifted again, showing what appeared to be architectural plans for a facility Chen didn't recognize. The structure was built into a mountainside, with chambers that seemed designed more for meditation than military training. "We've been constructing a new training facility in Colorado," Dr. Vasquez continued. "It's designed to safely initiate soldiers into these techniques while minimizing the risks that claimed Dr. Kowalski. But the process is still dangerous. Not everyone who begins the training emerges with their consciousness intact." Major Richardson's expression had grown increasingly troubled. "How many people have we lost?" "Officially? None. The soldiers who can't adapt to the training are reassigned to other duties with appropriate psychological counseling and memory modification to ensure operational security." "And unofficially?" Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment. 17 people have begun the advanced training. 5 have successfully completed it and are now operational. 7 have been reassigned after showing they lack the necessary psychological flexibility. 3 are still in training." "That's only 15, Chen observed. "The other 2, Dr. Vasquez's voice trailed off, and for the first time, she looked genuinely frightened. Like James, they disappeared during advanced exercises. But unlike James, they left behind more than just equipment anomalies. She manipulated the holographic display, showing what appeared to be security footage from the Colorado facility. Chen watched 2 figures moving through a shooting exercise, their movements displaying the same fluid grace he'd observed in Dr. Vasquez. But as the footage progressed, something disturbing became apparent. The figures were becoming increasingly translucent, as if they were fading from reality itself. "The final frames were recorded 3 days ago," Dr. Vasquez said softly. "Both subjects completed their exercises successfully, but they're becoming less substantial with each passing day. We can still communicate with them, but they report that our reality feels increasingly dreamlike to them. They describe experiencing multiple timelines simultaneously, seeing past and future events as if they were happening in the present. Davies was staring at the footage with horrified fascination. They're becoming unstuck from time itself. That's one way to put it. The monks call it dissolution into the infinite. They consider it a form of enlightenment, but from a military perspective, it's an unacceptable casualty rate. Chen felt a growing sense of dread as he began to understand the true scope of what they were dealing with. "And you want us to volunteer for this program?" Colonel Morrison stepped forward, his expression grave but determined. "Gentlemen, what you've learned today is classified at levels that require me to inform you that unauthorized disclosure would constitute treason. But yes, we're asking you to consider volunteering for advanced training. The geopolitical implications of this technology are too significant to ignore." The holographic display now showed satellite imagery of what appeared to be military installations around the world, each marked with symbols Chen didn't recognize. Intelligence reports suggest that other nations are developing similar capabilities. The Chinese have been conducting research into consciousness-based weapons for over a decade. The Russians have been experimenting with psychic warfare since the Cold War. If we don't develop these abilities, we risk falling behind in a new form of arms race, one where the human mind itself becomes the ultimate weapon. Dr. Vasquez had been reassembling her rifle during this discussion, and Chen noticed that she was being far more careful with the crystalline components than before. "There's something else you need to know," she said without looking up. "The reason my rifle responded unexpectedly today wasn't random. James, or whatever he's become, has been trying to communicate through quantum resonance patterns. Today's incident suggests he's getting stronger, more coherent." She looked directly at Chen, and in her eyes he saw a depth of knowledge and sorrow that spoke of experiences beyond normal human understanding. "He's been trying to warn us about something. The patterns we've been able to decode suggest that the consciousness-based techniques we've developed have attracted attention from entities that exist purely as quantum consciousness, things that were never human, but that have learned to manipulate the same fields we're working with." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Chen found himself instinctively checking the corners for shadows that shouldn't be there. "You're saying we've opened a door to something we don't understand." "I'm saying we've discovered that consciousness is not limited to biological forms, and that some forms of consciousness are not benevolent toward humanity." The monks understood this. It's why certain aspects of their training were forbidden. But military applications don't allow for such restrictions. As if summoned by her words, the lights in the room began to flicker again, and Chen heard something that made his blood freeze, the distant sound of rifle fire coming from somewhere that shouldn't exist, echoing through dimensions of space and time that his mind couldn't comprehend. Dr. Vasquez's rifle was fully assembled now, and the crystals along its barrel were beginning to glow with an intensity that cast strange shadows across the walls. But this time, she wasn't touching it at all. The sound of gunfire grew louder, more distinct, until it seemed to be coming from within the walls themselves. Chen's training kicked in despite the impossibility of the situation, and he found himself calculating firing positions and escape routes even as his rational mind struggled to process what he was experiencing. The rifle fire had a familiar rhythm, controlled, precise, professional. Someone was shooting with the methodical patience of a trained sniper. "James," Dr. Vasquez whispered, her face pale in the prismatic light emanating from her weapon. "He's trying to break through." The holographic display above her briefcase erupted into chaotic patterns of light and shadow, displaying what looked like multiple realities superimposed upon each other. Chen could see fragments of the debriefing room they occupied, but layered. Beneath it were images of other places, other times. A snow-covered mountain range where a lone figure crouched behind a rifle. A laboratory filled with equipment that seemed decades more advanced than anything he'd ever seen. A monastery perched on an impossible cliff face where robed figures sat in meditation, while reality itself seemed to bend around them. Colonel Morrison had drawn his sidearm, though Chen couldn't imagine what the man intended to shoot at. "Dr. Vasquez, can you contain this?" "I don't think containment is the right approach anymore," she replied, moving toward her rifle with cautious determination. "James has been trying to warn us, and I think we need to listen." The moment her hands touched the weapon, the chaotic holographic display stabilized into a single, crystal-clear image. Chen found himself looking at Dr. James Kowalski, but not as he'd appeared in the training footage. This version of the man seemed to exist in a state of quantum superposition, sometimes solid and clearly defined, sometimes translucent and shifting like smoke. His eyes held depths of knowledge that seemed to contain entire universes of experience. "Elena." The figure spoke, and its voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating through the quantum crystals rather than through air. "You have to stop the project. They're coming through." Dr. Vasquez's hands were steady on her rifle now, but Chen could see tears streaming down her face. "James, what happened to you? Where are you?" "Everywhere. Everywhen." "The consciousness field isn't empty, Elena. It's full of intelligences that have been waiting for someone to open the doorway. The shooting techniques, the quantum harmonics, they're not just manipulating physical reality. They're creating bridges between dimensions of consciousness that were meant to remain separate." The temperature in the room had dropped to the point where Chen could see his breath, and the walls themselves seemed to be rippling like water. Through the distortions, he caught glimpses of things that made him question his sanity. Shadows with too many angles, geometric forms that hurt to look at directly, and always the sound of that methodical rifle fire growing closer. Davies had backed against the wall, his face a mask of terror and fascination. "What are those things?" James's quantum-shifted form turned toward the young corporal, and when he spoke, his voice carried compassion alongside its otherworldly resonance. "Entities that exist as pure consciousness, unbound by physical form. Some are merely curious about our reality. Others—" He paused, and the holographic display flickered to show glimpses of landscapes that had never existed on Earth. Crystalline. Cities beneath alien stars, vast networks of consciousness that spanned galaxies, and hunting grounds where minds themselves were prey. Others view human consciousness as food. Dr. Vasquez had been making subtle adjustments to her rifle, and Chen realized she was preparing for a shot he couldn't understand. "James, can you show us how to close the bridges?" "Not close them. Redirect them. The consciousness entities are following the quantum resonance patterns created by the shooting techniques back to their source. Every shot fired with project. Harmonic technology creates a beacon in the consciousness field, but if we can create a counter-resonance, a harmonic interference pattern." The ghostly sniper's form began to solidify slightly, and Chen could see him more clearly now. James Kowalski looked like a man who had seen too much, experienced realities that human minds weren't designed to process. But there was also a strange peace in his expression, as if his impossible journey through quantum consciousness had taught him something profound about the nature of existence itself. "You'll need both snipers," James continued, gesturing to Chen and Davies. "Their consciousness patterns are still anchored in this reality. Elena, your initiation into the monastery's techniques makes you too quantum entangled to serve as an anchor. But these two, their minds are still grounded enough to create stable resonance points." Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold filling the room. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" "Learn the techniques, but learn them correctly, with proper safeguards and spiritual preparation. The monastery's training includes protection methods that the military applications have abandoned in favor of rapid deployment. Without those protections, every consciousness-based shot creates vulnerability to predation from entities that exist in pure thought." Major Richardson, who had been listening with growing alarm, stepped forward. This is insane. You're asking us to believe that shooting a rifle can open doorways to other dimensions? Major, Dr. Vasquez said quietly, look around you. What would you call this if not evidence of other dimensions? As if to underscore her point, the walls of the debriefing room suddenly became transparent, revealing the vast cosmic landscape that James's consciousness now inhabited. Chen could see the quantum threads that connected all conscious beings, gossamer strands of light that pulsed with thoughts, emotions, and intentions. But moving among those threads were things that had never been human, predatory intelligences, that followed the brightest consciousness beacons like sharks following blood trails through dark water. The shooting techniques create temporary tears in the fabric of reality, James explained, his form now fully visible despite its translucent nature. Normally, these tears would heal quickly, but the military's approach, using consciousness as a weapon rather than as a spiritual practice, leaves the tears open longer than they should be. The entities have learned to slip through during those windows of vulnerability. Davies, despite his obvious fear, was studying the cosmic landscape with the analytical mind of a trained sniper. How many of them are there? In this local cluster of consciousness space? Hundreds. In the broader quantum field? James's expression grew grave. Millions. Most are harmless. Curious observers, consciousness archaeologists studying the development of biological intelligence. But some. The holographic display showed glimpses of predatory entities that seemed to be composed of mathematical concepts given malevolent form. Some view the emergence of consciousness-based weapons as an opportunity to establish hunting grounds in physical reality. Colonel Morrison had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he spoke with the voice of a man wrestling with decisions that would affect global security. If we shut down Project Harmonic, how do we know other nations won't continue their own research? You don't shut it down, Dr. Vasquez replied, her voice carrying new determination. You transform it. The monks have been working with consciousness-based techniques for over 1,000 years without attracting predatory entities. They know how to create protective frameworks that prevent quantum tears from becoming dimensional doorways. She turned to Chen and Davies, her eyes intense with purpose. But it requires genuine spiritual development, not just technical training. The consciousness modifications needed for safe operation of these techniques can't be separated from fundamental changes in how you perceive reality and your relationship to it. Chen found himself thinking about the Buddhist monk in Afghanistan again, the old man's warnings about the dangers of seeking power over natural forces. The monk I met, he said, true mastery comes from understanding your place within the system, not controlling it. Exactly. James's quantum form nodded approvingly. The military approach treats consciousness as a tool to be wielded. The monastic approach recognizes consciousness as part of a larger web of interconnected awareness. When you shoot from that perspective, you're not forcing your will upon reality. You're participating in the natural harmony of cause and effect. The rifle fire that had been echoing through dimensional space was growing more urgent now, and Chen realized it wasn't just James shooting. Other voices were joining the quantum communication, the two missing test subjects who had begun dissolving into multiple timelines, and perhaps others who had been lost to the dangerous applications of consciousness-based techniques. They're trying to hold the entities back, Dr. Vasquez said, her face creased with concentration as she interpreted the harmonic patterns. But they can't maintain the barrier much longer. We need to create a permanent solution. She raised her rifle, but instead of aiming at any physical target, she seemed to be sighting along one of the gossamer consciousness threads that connected the room to the cosmic landscape beyond. I can create a counter-resonance pattern that will seal the quantum tears, but I'll need anchoring points in stable consciousness, minds that haven't been quantum entangled. Chen and Davies looked at each other, both understanding what she was asking without the request being explicitly stated. They would need to open themselves to the consciousness-based techniques, allow their minds to become temporarily linked with the quantum field, and trust that their grounding in physical reality would be enough to prevent them from dissolving into the infinite like the other test subjects. "What are the chances we come back from this intact?" Davies asked, his voice steady despite the enormity of what they were contemplating. James's quantum form flickered, showing glimpses of the man he had been before his consciousness became distributed across multiple realities. If you approach it with the proper spiritual preparation, with genuine respect for the forces you're working with, rather than attempting to dominate them, the risk is minimal. But you have to let go of the ego-driven desire to control outcomes. You have to trust in something larger than your individual will. Chen felt a strange calm settling over him, the same sensation he'd experienced during his most successful shots, that moment of perfect stillness when self and target and environment became one unified system. "What do we need to do?" Dr. Vasquez began making complex adjustments to her rifle, and Chen noticed that some of the crystalline components were actually growing as she worked, extending new facets and connections in response to her consciousness-directed intentions. "First, you need to understand that what we're about to attempt will change you permanently. You'll never again be able to see reality as a collection of separate objects following purely physical laws. Once you've experienced the quantum consciousness field directly, you become part of it." The cosmic landscape visible through the transparent walls was changing now, as predatory entities drawn by the consciousness beacons of Project Harmonic began to gather in greater numbers. Chen could see them probing at the barriers that James and the other quantum-displaced snipers were desperately maintaining. Some of the entities were vast beyond comprehension, consciousness structures that spanned light years and contained the accumulated experience of entire civilizations. Others were small and cunning, specialized predators that had evolved to feed specifically on technological species that developed consciousness-based weapons. "The irony," James said, his form becoming more solid as he focused his distributed awareness, "is that the techniques work best when you're not trying to use them as weapons at all. The most accurate shots, the ones that seem to defy physics, they happen when the shooter becomes completely selfless, when individual will dissolves into universal intention." Davies was studying the approaching entities with professional interest, despite his fear. "So, we're not shooting to kill. We're shooting to... what? Harmonize?" "You're shooting to participate in the natural order of cause and effect," Dr. Vasquez explained, her rifle now fully configured for whatever impossible shot she was planning. "When consciousness aligns perfectly with environmental conditions, when intention becomes indistinguishable from natural law, the outcome is inevitable without being forced." Chen felt understanding dawn like sunrise after a long night. "That's why you never seemed to pull the trigger. The shot was already determined by the harmony you'd created. The rifle firing was just the physical manifestation of a decision that had been made at the quantum level. Now you're beginning to understand." She smiled, and for the first time since this ordeal began, her expression held genuine hope. "The entities that are trying to break through, they're drawn to the aggressive, dominating use of consciousness-based techniques, but they can't track or exploit techniques that work through surrender and harmony. Those approaches create no quantum tiers because they don't force reality to change. They simply allow reality to express its inherent perfection." The walls of the debriefing room were now completely transparent, and Chen could see that the military base around them existed in a bubble of stable reality surrounded by the vast cosmos of interconnected consciousness. The predatory entities had formed a perimeter around this bubble, probing for weaknesses, waiting for an opportunity to break through into physical reality. "Time's running out," James warned, his quantum form beginning to flicker as the effort of maintaining the defensive barrier drained his dispersed consciousness. "Elena, if you're going to attempt the counter-resonance shot, it has to be now." Dr. Vasquez took her position, but instead of the solitary stance Chen had observed on the mountain, she gestured for him and Davies to join her. "I need you both to open your consciousness to the quantum field while maintaining your anchoring in physical reality. Think of it as learning to breathe underwater. You remain fundamentally human, but you develop the ability to function in a medium that would normally be hostile to biological consciousness. Chen and Davies moved to flank her, and the moment they came within range of her rifle's quantum field amplifiers, Chen felt his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his skull. Suddenly, he could perceive the gossamer threads of connection that linked every conscious being, could feel the vast web of intention and awareness that underlied all physical reality. But more disturbing, he could also sense the hungry attention of the entities surrounding their bubble of stable reality. "Don't try to fight them or hide from them," Dr. Vasquez instructed, her voice now coming from within his own consciousness rather than through his ears. "Simply be present with complete openness and no agenda. Predatory consciousness feeds on fear, desire, and the attempt to control outcomes. It cannot process or target consciousness that exists in a state of pure presence." Davies's mental voice joined their quantum-linked communication. "This is insane. I can see their thoughts. They're planning to use our reality as a feeding ground for other technological species. They want to turn Earth into a trap for civilizations that develop consciousness-based weapons, which is exactly what will happen if Project Harmonic continues with its current approach," James added, his presence now stabilized by their anchoring consciousness. "But if we can demonstrate a different way, if we can show that consciousness-based techniques can exist without creating vulnerability to predation." Dr. Vasquez's rifle was now aimed at what appeared to be empty space, but Chen could see through the quantum field that she was targeting the fundamental resonance frequency that held the dimensional tiers open. One shot, fired with perfect harmony between consciousness and environmental conditions, could create a counter-resonance that would seal the tiers and redirect the predatory entities away from Earth's local consciousness space. But the shot required something Chen had never attempted before, firing a rifle not to hit a target, but to participate in the cosmic symphony of cause and effect. The bullet would travel not just through physical space, but through dimensions of consciousness, carrying with it the intention to heal rather than harm, to close rather than penetrate, to protect rather than destroy. "Ready?" Dr. Vasquez asked, though Chen could sense that she was really asking if they were prepared to fundamentally transform their understanding of what it meant to be human. Looking through the transparent walls of their reality bubble, Chen could see the predatory entities pressing closer, their alien geometries shifting with predatory anticipation. Beyond them, the vast cosmos of interconnected consciousness stretched into infinity, beautiful and terrible in its scope. And somewhere in that cosmic web, the quantum-displaced consciousness of James Kowalski and the other lost test subjects held a defensive line that wouldn't last much longer. Chen felt the same perfect stillness he'd experienced during his best shots. That moment when ego dissolved and only the shot remained, inevitable and pure. "Ready." Davies nodded, his consciousness radiating the calm determination of someone who had found something worth risking everything to protect. "Ready." Dr. Vasquez smiled, and Chen felt through their quantum link that this smile contained not just hope, but absolute certainty. She had found the harmonic frequency she needed, had aligned her consciousness with the natural order of cause and effect so perfectly that the outcome was no longer in doubt. And in the moment before she fired, or allowed the shot to fire itself, through her, Chen realized that they weren't just saving Earth from predatory entities. They were demonstrating to the entire cosmos that consciousness-based power could be wielded with wisdom, that technological species could develop beyond the trap of using awareness as a weapon. The rifle fired without sound, without recoil, without any physical indication that anything had happened at all. But the bullet that emerged carried with it the harmonized intention of three consciousness working in perfect unity, traveling, not through space, but through the quantum field itself, seeking not to destroy but to heal the tiers that divided reality from the infinite cosmos of pure awareness. And as the counter-resonance propagated through dimensions of consciousness that human language had no words to describe, Chen watched the predatory entities fade like shadows before dawn, not destroyed, but simply redirected toward regions of the cosmos where their nature was part of the natural order rather than an invasive threat. The walls of the debriefing room solidified back into concrete and steel, but Chen knew he would never again see them as merely physical barriers. They were still part of the vast web of consciousness that connected all things, still permeable, to awareness that had learned to function in harmony with, rather than opposition to, the fundamental forces of reality. Dr. Vasquez lowered her rifle, and Chen could see in her eyes the deep satisfaction of someone who had finally found a way to use her abilities in service of something larger than individual will or national interests. Project Harmonic continues, she said quietly, but now it serves protection rather than domination, healing rather than harm. James Kowalski's quantum form appeared one last time, his consciousness now stable enough to maintain coherent communication. "The real training begins now," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had experienced the dissolution of individual identity and chosen to return to serve others facing the same journey. Learning to shoot with perfect accuracy was just the beginning. Learning to exist as conscious beings in a cosmos where thought itself has power, that's the real challenge. Chen looked at Davies, then at Dr. Vasquez, then at the quantum-shifted form of James, and realized that their small group had become something unprecedented in human history. The first military unit trained to operate in the overlap between physical reality and the infinite field of consciousness that underlay all existence. The shot that couldn't be made had been made, and in making it, they had transformed not just their own understanding of what was possible, but had opened a new chapter in the evolution of human awareness itself. Outside, the mountain peaks caught the last light of sunset, beautiful and unchanging. But Chen now knew that beauty and permanence were just the surface appearance of a reality far more fluid and responsive to consciousness than anyone had dared to imagine. The real war, the one fought in dimensions of awareness that most humans never suspected existed, had only just begun. And for the first time in military history, Earth had soldiers trained to fight not with weapons, but with the focused harmony of consciousness itself,